Joining me right now with reaction, Chairman and Editor-in-Chief of Forbes Media, Steve Forbes, and Moody's Chief Economist, John Lonski. Steve, what do you think her legacy is going to be there at the Fed?
More of a seat warmer. She didn't change the policy substantially of Bernanke, had some tweaks on it, but not any big push. No big push to reduce their bloated portfolio. No big push to get real interest rates back again in the credit markets, to get the credit markets working again. No real deregulation of banks, which has hurt bank lending. So I think it's she'll go out with a shower of praise, but I think the record is pretty spotty.
Okay, so if you go back in the history books, 30 years from now, and you look back, and will she get blamed for a few things there, or is it all Bernanke?
Mostly Bernanke,
okay.
But she didn't undo Bernanke.
John Lonski, going into Jerome Powell, are things going to change much, or is this more the, status quo?
I doubt if we're going to notice much of a difference right away. I think there will be a difference as far as the regulation of banks is concerned. The Fed will take a more liberal approach towards regulation as far as banking goes. But monetary policy, interest rate policy, the same. And they'll follow through with their scheduled reduction as far as the Fed's holdings of Treasury and agency-backed securities go.
It feels like the Fed has been the only game in town, right, for the last sort of decade, right, Steve? I mean, and this is, to Bernanke's credit, and I know you're not entirely a fan of what he did, but at the time, it really felt scary enough that you needed someone there to backstop some of this. But at some point, you became pushing on the string.
But there are 2 points. One is the crisis of 2008. The Fed is supposed to be taking action, lender of last resort and the sort. He did the way he should. But after that is where you can really criticize him. His programs, continuous quantitative easing, as they call it, which just ended up gumming up the credit markets, hurting lending to small and new businesses, and hurting bank lending.
All right, so you think that's going to change, though, John? You think that,
oddly enough,
the orders out of the White House, too, to get rid of all these regulations, it'll be different?
I think following the crisis, Bernanke and Yellen perhaps did the right thing. We've had a very vibrant corporate bond market. We're seeing a lot of debt refinancing going on. That's brought down the cost of credit on balance for companies. Steve may be right, however. What got forgotten in the process were small businesses, mostly because of the heavy regulations placed upon smaller banks that dried up credit to smaller businesses and hurt jobs creation. It especially hurt the creation of job opportunities for new entrants into the labor force. But otherwise, just great. Look at the equity market. If we have inflation, it's not with consumer products, it's with equity prices, perhaps.
But you could go right back to Bernanke, perhaps, and blame that strategy as well as Janet Yellen. At some point, the markets have to be based on something, right? And you're trading, pretty high multiples right now, Steve. Is that dependent because on tax reform? People think that corporate earnings are going to go up because tax reform is going to go through, and that justifies a multiple like we're seeing in the S&P.
Well, first of all, companies got their act together after 2008. Most of them did. GE is an exception, but most of them got their act together in very fine fashion. The Europeans began to get their act together, and so they had some real earnings, especially in recent times. But the key thing is that companies are dependent on getting a tax bill through, and if you don't get a 20% corporate tax rate, you don't get a good pass-through piece, you'll see a very disappointed market. If it goes much above 20 or they delay it, people are going to say,
You've been pretty critical of this whole tax plan. You want and I know you want a flat tax.
No, but other than doing the corporate side, they've just made it needlessly complicated by worshiping projections which are not worth even the paper they're printed on from the Congressional Budget Office. You'll learn more about the future from your daily horoscope than you will from the CBO. So they unnecessarily put themselves in a straitjacket, which is why they're going through these crazy convolutions. Now they're telling individual investors, in one version you hear going around, that if you sell a stock, you have to take the lowest basis price instead of the high. You're just nitpicking crazy stuff like that.
And yet they never bothered to even touch what the president campaigned on, and that was raising taxes for private equity investors to treat their income as income,